Hello, guys and gals, and this is part 19 of our reading of Guinevere, and we're getting near the end of the book by now. As always, we're going to go over the copyright information first, and, oops, there we go. Copyright 1981 by Sharan Newman. I have the author's written consent to, read this book on my channel, my YouTube channel. I also have to say that this book is still for sale, along with the Chessboard Queen, which is the second book of the trilogy, and Guinevere Evermore, which is the final book of the trilogy. It should be for sale where most books are sold, especially online retailers, would be my guess. Anyways, in the last episode, we discovered that Mark was the prisoner that, the slave that the Saxons kept. The one that Elswitha called Coral, or it's probably more like Coearl or something like that, because an earl is one of their high-ranking people, and so she's basically calling him my lord, basically, if I'm understanding the language properly, and I'm probably not. Anyways, Guinevere was captured, but Arthur, using Gawain's plan, was able to scare off a lot of the Saxons by creating a fake monster and scaring them all away. And they managed to get not only Guinevere but also Mark. But Mark is really distant from being a captive for so long. Over 3 years in captivity. Anyways, we are going to pick up where we left off. And like I say, we've only got a few episodes left. We are already to 350. Anyways, but I am sure my father will better express our gratitude when we arrive at my home. Please excuse me now. I will stay with Mark in case he wants something. She backed away, making a mental note to ask Sidra how one politely left a conversation like that. Arthur was still staring at her, and she felt she had not acquitted herself well. He finally came to himself and returned to the place where he had left his saddle and blanket. What a dolt I am, he mourned. She must have thought me a country clod, standing there gaping at her, slack-jawed, unable to reply to the simplest sentence. He gave a quick glance around the camp, saw that everyone seemed to be taken care of, and dropped at once into a sound sleep. He awoke up suddenly to realize that it was already night. He jumped to his feet, conscious that he had neglected his men and failed to set a watch, but to his relief everything was in good order. Some of the men were still snoring, but others had wakened and started a campfire over which a whole pig was roasting. He called to his foster brother, C. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, C-E-I, C, who was watching the spit with hungry eyes. Where did that meat come from? He demanded. C chuckled. It just wandered through the camp about dusk, thinking we were all asleep, and began rummaging in our packs. When it got to mine, I just lay there, my hand on my long knife. A swipe, a squeal, and roast pork. It's only a small one, or I might not have been able to hold it, he added modestly, but it will feed us all tonight. Already the men were rousing to the smell of fresh meat. In spring it wasn't often that they had anything but smoked or salted remains from the slaughter in the fall. This was a reward in itself. Arthur knew that Guinevere was also asleep next to Mark. His back was to her, but he had overcome his apathy enough to cover her with his cloak. Arthur wondered if he should wake her, but thought it might be indelicate. He saw to it, however, that the best cut of pork was saved for her. Despite the desire of Guinevere to return quickly to her family, Arthur decided that it would be wisest to remain there for the rest of the night and finish the journey the next day. Now that most of the men were rested and their few cuts attended to, there would be no problem finding someone to keep watch. He doubted that the Saxons had tried to follow them, but it was just as well to be careful. All the men were in high spirits. They were immensely pleased with themselves. It boosted their morale wonderfully to know that the Saxons, who were so ferocious in battle, would run like frightened children from a ridiculous contraption such as the one they had created. Consequently, the banter that evening was light and cheerful. Most of the soldiers were too busy or too tired to be aware that the other person rescued was Mark. Arthur decided not to tell them. It wasn't likely that Mark would let them know. He stayed away from them all and as far from the firelight as possible. Guinevere refused to leave him. She only got up for a moment to give a short speech of thanks for their daring and resourcefulness, and then retired. They all agreed her words were appropriate and well-deserved. The sun had barely risen when they left the next morning. Even traveling by the better roads, it would take almost all day to reach the villa, and Arthur guessed how eager Leodegrance and Gwenlyn would be for their return. But he underestimated them. That same morning, Leodegrance had become disgruntled by the ordeal of waiting and decided to ride in the direction from which the party should return. Gwenlyn, seeing his intent, insisted on going with him. "But my dear," he argued, "you are needed here. Who will entertain Merlin? Who will arrange dinner for everyone?" "Penserna will see to the dinner, and Merlin can see to himself. I'm going with you." "But what if they were not successful?" Leodegrance cautioned. Gwendolyn's hands clenched. "All the more reason for me to be with you." He saw that there would be no more discussion. The two of them set out alone together. Leodegrance heard them singing before he saw them. His heart lifted. He urged his horse ahead, and soon the whole company came into view. Arthur rode at the head, and not far behind came Guinevere, riding behind some heavily cloaked man. As soon as she spotted them, she waved excitedly. Leodegrance and Gwenlyn hurried to her. Neither would be truly sure she was safe until they had their arms around her. What was the matter with that man? He was trying to pull her away from them. Now he was pushing Guinevere from the horse and trying to escape. She was fighting him and yelling something they couldn't make out. Then Guinevere gave a sharp tug and managed to pull off the cloak. Leodegrance heard Gwenlyn's cry. A scream turned inward into a gasp. He suddenly felt as if someone had hit him hard directly below the ribs. He couldn't breathe. Guinevere was hanging onto the man's arm now, calling, "Help me. He doesn't want to come home. Hold him." They were with her at once. Mark knew there would be no escape now, and found that he was sobbing, too, as his mother held him again, her hands searching him, touching arms, legs, there and whole. "Oh, my darling, your poor face," kissing those hideous scars, as if they could be charmed away like a childhood bump. Leodegrance, hands trembling, reached out for him. How old his father had become, and Guinevere smiling as proudly as if she had invented him. For a sudden flash of time, Mark felt that it might after all, be possible to come home. The rest of the journey took longer than anticipated because neither parent wanted to be more than a hand's reach away from their son. Guinevere happily traded places and rode behind her father so that she could hug him and explain everything that had happened. It was well that Gwenlyn's horse knew how to find its own way home, for she gave it little guidance. It was late afternoon before they were spotted by the guard, and as they rode in, the entire household was at the gate cheering. "God Almighty!" Penserna exclaimed. "It's Lord Mark." "Can't be, you old fool," someone muttered then. "I'm darned if you aren't right." There was silence, and everyone tried to comprehend this miracle. And then the cheering became hysterical. Mark lifted his head and looked at them. He tried to pick out their faces, to find one that meant something to him, but they were just faces, blurred and anonymous. The glow in the morning that for a time had convinced him it could be the same again had meanwhile vanished. He felt a fool to have believed that he could go home and be cosseted by his family and spoiled by the servants, and that the last few years would melt into nightmare, something misty and unreal. But with the first sight of the fields and brooks, the memory came back to him. "Matthew and John aren't here," he thought with a jolt. "I'm the only one left. Their ghosts will hound me, taunt me, every second I stay." As soon as he rode into the courtyard, Arthur felt a return of the sense of inferiority he had known before as he changed from his role of leader to that of guest. He could tell that this was Guinevere's natural setting. As she dismounted and casually handed the reins to the stableman, Arthur noticed Gawain standing, leaning on the doorway. He grinned at Guinevere, who ran to him, laughing, and let him swing her around as he hugged her. "I knew it was your idea," she cried, "and I'm so glad that the days are getting longer so that you are awake to greet me. You won't believe this, but we found my brother Mark. He's alive after all. Isn't that wonderful?" And she hugged him again. Arthur watched them in amazement. How could he treat her so casually? There he stood, one arm across her shoulder, not even looking at her, but chatting with some of the other rescuers. He had said she was like a sister, but a thought struck him with a suddenness that made him sick. She must be more than that. She must already be engaged to him. They looked well together. He had to admit, suddenly all his heroics seemed a little flat. He looked around for Merlin. Merlin wasn't far. He had been watching Arthur as he observed Gawain and Guinevere, and had guessed what Arthur was thinking. He would certainly do nothing to disabuse Arthur of the idea. Merlin had not really looked at Guinevere for some time. He knew she had grown, but was startled and worried by how mature her beauty was. He had hoped somehow that it would fade as she grew older. He shook his head. It was clear from one side of her that she was as naive as ever. It would never do to let that one around his Arthur too much. She didn't belong. This idiocy of his about a marriage could only mean trouble. Mark was hurried off to his old room, and his own clothes were pulled from cedar chests for him to change into. Gwendolyn hated to have him out of her sight for an instant, but resigned herself to it, only making him promise to bathe quickly, change, and come to her room before eating. It was hard to bathe quickly with 3 years of filth to be scrubbed from one's body, but Mark dressed as fast as possible, and, his heart constricted at the thought of having to face everyone, to explain, to retell all the horror, he left his room. He nearly ran into Rihanna. She stepped back from him with a little gasp, then gave him her hand. The other hand was holding a small girl child, who stared at him with wide, familiar eyes. It took Mark a moment to remember who she was. Then he gave the child a searching look, which caused her to hide her face in her mother's skirt. When he held Rihanna's hand very gently, there was something about her that made people want to be gentle. I remember now when Matthew came back from his leave just before. He told me then. He said, "I've given Rihanna grandmother's ring. I never thought I would give it to anyone. He told us to take care of you if anything happened, but he was happier than I have ever seen him." Rihanna smiled at him, a smile full of compassion and tenderness. "Thank you," she said. "I'm glad you've come home." They went together to Gwendolyn's sitting room, where, to Mark's relief, only a few people had gathered. After a few hearty slaps on the back and comments of pleasure on his return, Mark was even more relieved to know that no one planned on questioning him. Their minds were taken up by a message that had just come to Cador from Sidra. Gwendolyn only insisted that Mark sit on the same cushions with her, so that she could have him always close enough to touch, should she need reassurance that he was truly alive. Mark didn't pay any attention at first. He was back in the mire of his own misery. Then a name caught him by surprise and jolted him to awareness. "Alswitha. What about her?" "Oh, I'm sorry, dear," Gwendolyn smoothed her hand through his hair. "I didn't mean to remind you of them. Sidra has just sent us a note. It seems that since Ael broke his word and attacked us again, not to mention kidnapping your sister, it is now necessary that some sort of decision to be made about what to do with this girl we have as hostage." "Don't worry, son," Leodegrance patted his shoulder. "It's nothing to do with you. I suppose I must go to the council to keep them from being too vengeful." "What do you mean?" Mark's voice was hard, but his father didn't notice. "Well, now that the vow is broken, her life is certainly forfeit. I imagine we will have to execute her, but I'll do my best to see that it is as painless as possible, and that she isn't tortured first." "What?" Guinevere and Mark spoke at once, but Mark's voice was louder. "How can you talk so calmly of murdering her?" Leodegrance tried to pacify him. "I don't want you to bother about such things on your first night home. It is unfortunate that this happened now. I will go with Cador and do what I can for the girl. You must not let yourself be concerned." Mark gazed around the room, as if everyone had suddenly gone mad. Arthur squirmed uncomfortably. Merlin and Cador just looked worried about his state. Guinevere was the only one who seemed as horrified as he was. "I'm going with you," he stated. There was no arguing with him, and in the end, Gwendolyn and Guinevere insisted that they must go too. Arthur and Merlin were already required to attend the council or trial, whatever it was to be, and as the matter was serious, and Mark refused to wait, they agreed to leave the next morning. That night, Mark lay in his own bed for the first time in more than 3 years. He was clean and well fed. He was warm and no man's property. He was all the things he had never thought he would be again, but he could not sleep. Each time he drifted towards slumber, he felt again cool hands stroking his burning face. Chapter 16. Sidra met them in the courtyard. "I'm glad you came so quickly," she told him, kissing her husband without missing a word. "Some of the men were for starting without you, not knowing if Guinevere could be recovered. They said that you would be too busy with her to bother about this, and it wouldn't matter anyways whether she was safe or not, as the issue was the broken truce. Come in at once. Never mind the horses. Your man can take care of them." She gestured at Mark, who was again wrapped in his ragged cloak. He began gathering up the reins. Gwendolyn started to expostulate, but Leodogran stopped him. "Not now. We can explain later." His expression reminded her that it might be best if Mark were not present for the debate of the council. "Guinevere, my dear," Sidra embraced her fondly, "I'm so glad that you are all right. I was worried until I heard of Gawain's plan, and that Arthur was going to get you. Then I knew you would be back soon. Arthur hasn't failed at anything yet." She led them all into the castle. It was late in the morning, 2 days after they had left the villa. Even with the spring sunshine outside, it was dark within and chilly. The fire on the enormous hearth did little to dispel the gloom. It took some time for their eyes to adjust. First they only made out the forms of men, seated in a semicircle, the tribunal awaiting the prisoner. Then Cador clenched his fists and strode to the man seated at the center. "How is it, Colum, that you begin this meeting without us? And why are you seated in the place of honor? Are you the Dux Bellorum now, the leader of the armies of Britain? Under what authority do you convene this meeting without my permission?" Cador was impressively angry, but Colum was too old and too powerful in his own right to be cowed, although he did relinquish the chair. "This matter could not await your arrival, since we have no idea when that would be. It is a clear case of oath-breaking, and the only question before us is how the girl should be punished, so that her father and the other Saxon scum will not so trifle with us again. As the largest landholder present, I naturally presided. Now, however, I am happy to turn the matter over to you." He moved to another chair with ponderous dignity. Cador watched until he had settled himself. "Thank you, my Lord Colum. Normally, I would take the seat of honor in my own home, but today I feel that it is time I give it up to someone else, to a man who has earned it, and who shall soon have the final decision in more cases than this. Arthur, the time is coming when this seat will be more familiar to you than the back of your war horse is now. I would be honored if your rule of Britain would start here." He stood behind the chair, waiting for Arthur to take his place. Arthur swallowed hard. His eyes darted about the room in panic. He realized at once that the honor was barbed. He did not want to be the one to sentence Alswitha to death. Merlin moved within a range of sight, and almost imperceptibly, the older man nodded. With a sinking heart, Arthur sat in the seat of judgment. Cador spoke again in more normal tones. "My wife tells me that the girl has been sent for. Where is she?" "I believe she wished to be formally dressed when she faced you," Sidra explained. It seemed only fair. She seemed to be down. Oh, she should be down soon. Guinevere's maid Risa is with her now." Gawain sat at the other end of the hall in one of the many niches around the walls. It suddenly occurred to him that with everyone down here, it would be the perfect time for him to slip upstairs with Risa. After all, no one had asked him to take part in this, and for that he was grateful. It was not the sort of thing he enjoyed, so there was no reason why he shouldn't use the time for something better. He could almost feel Risa under him already. Then he saw them come into the hall. Risa was leading Alswitha gently, giving her an arm to lean on. When he caught the look of terror and despair on the Saxon girl's face, his desire for Risa crumbled. Risa stayed next to Alswitha until they reached the center of the hall. A narrow strip of sunlight laid across the floor, having made its way through one of the lookout slits high overhead. Risa placed Elswitha so that the light shone directly on her. Then she gave the girl's hand a sympathetic squeeze and came over to the recess where Gawain watched. She sat next to him and took his hand. She gave him no other greeting. Elswitha dressed herself in her finest clothes. The swan cape came past her waist, and the light reflected off each of her golden ornaments. She made no attempt to soften her Saxon appearance, but faced her judges proudly. Merlin, speak to her, Arthur commanded. Tell her what has happened and why she is before us. I'm sure she already knows, Merlin answered, but he spoke a few words to her anyways. She nodded understandingly. Okay. Arthur sighed. He longed for a sword in his hand and a horde of bloodthirsty invaders to attack. The question before us is, what shall be done with this clear breach of faith and violation of an oath? This woman is bound for the good conduct of her father, Ael. I have seen with my own eyes that Ael has crossed into our territory. He has taken in Ygfrith, who was also to be bound for him. And worst of all, he kidnapped the lady Guinevere, and in doing so, has killed a number of good men, who might one day have been leaders of our land. How can we ensure that this will not happen again? There was silence, and Leodogran spoke up, his voice sorrowful. Her life is forfeit now. There is no other way. We can only do it as mercifully as possible. Here now, another lord interrupted. What will that gain us? Ael doesn't care what happens to her, or he wouldn't have left her here. I say we send her back to him alive, but keep a few mementos for ourselves. Her nose, say, or some fingers. Then he will know we mean business. There was a murmur of approval for this. Guinevere listened in growing horror. Why didn't her father answer this? What was wrong with him? Lord Strader of the South Welsh spoke now. It seems more merciful to give her her life in exchange for a nose, and certainly the knowledge that their children would be returned to them maimed would make those Saxons think again before turning them over to us on false promises. There would be no more broken vows if they knew their daughters would be returned to them in such a fashion. How could they discuss this horrible thing so calmly, Guinevere wondered. Some of the lords were leaning back in their chairs, picking their teeth with their knives and grinning at poor Elswitha. For a moment she forgot that Elswitha was Saxon, heathen and an enemy. She hated all those men with their ugly, leering faces. She almost hated her father for saying nothing to stop them. Only Arthur sat stiffly, his back not resting against his chair, his face showing nothing of his thoughts. Guinevere noticed that Merlin and her parents were not paying attention to Elswitha or to the other men. They were watching Arthur. You are too soft, Strader, Colum grumbled. Your lands haven't been overrun by these vermin. Your lands haven't been overrun by these vermin. Your tenants haven't been killed and their daughters carried away by these. He spat, not finding a word both strong enough for his feelings and speakable in the presence of ladies. That's true, another lord removed his knife from his mouth long enough to agree, but I think she should be sent home alive. She should be able to tell them what happened to her. Why don't we just cut off her nose and little finger and send her back to Ael? But first, and he smiled as if well pleased with himself, let the soldiers have her a while. The color left in Elswitha's face strained, and her eyes rolled back in her head as she fell. Guinevere screamed and rushed over to her, but Mark was there first. His cloak was off, and he was dressed again as a nobleman. The scars across his face burned with fury. He caught the unconscious girl and wrapped her in his arms as he glared about the room. At first he was too angry to speak, and all the lords just gaped at him. To their superstitious minds, he might have just risen from the dead. You vile animals, Mark finally whispered. The astonished silence was so complete that his hissed words sounded like shouting. You will not touch her. Is this your city of reason, Arthur? Will you found your new world on innocent blood? Do you think anyone could make civilized men out of these base rabble? You are a dreamer and a fool, and I want no part of anything you may try to do for them. Elswitha moved in his arms, and he lifted her face to his. Sidra was beside them now, with a cup of wine, which she held to the girl's lips. Her eyes flickered open, and she gave a cry of joy when she saw Mark's face. Again, I'm not sure if I'm saying this name right. I'm going to say it's Coral. She sobbed, "My Leoford Laford? Me Leoford Wytha," Mark murmured, burying his face in her hair. He then rose and faced the assembly, but did not release her. She clung to him, unaware that the tears running down her face. Of the tears running down her face. Sidra gently took Guinevere back to her place. "This is not for us to meddle in," she told her. "This must be taken care of in their own way." Gwendolyn gripped her husband's hand so tightly that her ring cut into his flesh. "She is in love with him. He is in love with her," she whispered, her voice disbelieving and afraid. Leodegrance nodded. But she's not even Christian." "Yes," he carefully disengaged her hand. "But, Gwendolyn, we must not challenge them. We cannot lose him again." Mark faced Arthur. His voice was still tight with anger. "What will you decide, Lord? I say that I have been more ill-treated by the Saxons than any man here, and I claim this woman as retribution for my suffering, that is." He bent his face to Alswithi's and spoke so tenderly that Gwendolyn felt ashamed for listening. Whilst thou with me, Juristan?" She smiled at him and answered in Latin, "I will stay with you and go with you anywhere forever." Arthur watched them. He felt a bitter pain at their obvious devotion to each other. He knew that it would be worse than murder to part them now. Why should he? It seemed such an easy and acceptable way out of his dilemma, but he feared that it would not satisfy all the lords who wanted revenge. What could he do? He studied them. All of these men were all now secure upon their holdings, but they were in need of more wealth to rebuild what had been destroyed. Perhaps an appeal to their greed might induce them to relent. "I agree that Lord Mark, son of Leodegrance, should have the right to purchase the hostage for his own use, if he so wishes. I set the price of her release at the weight of my sword and shield in gold." There was a burst of outrage from the men in the circle. Arthur raised his hand for silence. "I have not finished. It will be distributed among myself and the lords here for use in repairing damages caused by the invaders. Is that acceptable to all?" The lords were quiet, each one trying to compute his possible share. Arthur decided to take their silence as approval. "Very well," he said. "It is agreed. Mark, can you pay this amount for her?" Leodegrance stood up. "I will guarantee this sum of gold for my son. He shall have it from his share of my estate." "No," Alswitha spoke for the first time to them all. "I can pay my own price. No one will say I had to be purchased. I come to him willingly." We are going to stop the reading here. We have been reading Guinevere by Sharan Newman. If you like this content, make sure you like and subscribe and ring the bell so you know when I upload. And if you want to support me in any way, all that information will be in the description below. As always, thanks for watching, everyone. Have a great day.